Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experience and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self-awareness. I am Artemis, and we are going to be tackling a very large topic today and a general question which might come about if someone is questioning their gender identity. And that question would be,
Drum roll, please.
Oh,
am I transgender? So, first off, while it would be nice to be able to just type in some incredibly complex questions into Google and get a very simple answer. Google, what's for dinner?
I hope you'll like it. It's called Be an Adult and Make It Yourself.
I personally believe that this is just part of the longer journey we are supposed to take while we're here. And the answer to that question is something that really only you can decide. I will go and talk about some of the ways in which you can go about figuring that out for yourself. And I'll also share some of my own personal journey in arriving to my own gender conclusions. A quick disclaimer, I am not a licensed practitioner of any kind, and nor do I claim to have the right answers. I put this information out there in the hopes that it will help someone, and it should not be taken as medical advice. If you're under the legal age in your country, do not lie to your doctors just so you can gain access to something that you feel you need. There's a reason that those obstacles exist, and I know adolescence is hard, it can suck sometimes, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Really. If you are a young female, I would highly recommend that you listen to a woman named Abigail Schreier speak about the phenomenon of teenage girls claiming that they are trans. You can find any number of her interviews on YouTube. Of most note of what she has said, testosterone therapy does help in the short term with anxiety and depression, but when used in the long term with women, it can have unwanted and dangerous side effects, especially in those women who are not transgender. Okay, so with that out of the way, as we always do, we're going to start with definitions. So to define transgender, it is denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their birth sex. So I did another video explaining what I believe is the difference between sex and gender, and I do believe that there is a difference, which I will link in the card above. But for brevity's sake, I will say that sex has to do only with the parts that you have between your legs, aka the parts that you can use to reproduce during an activity by the same name. And gender is more what's in your brain. Having said that, for me, a transgender individual is not the same as a transsexual individual. And I believe that there's an important distinction to make between the two, and here's why. If you're trying to determine whether or not you're transgender, it would be important to know what transgender actually meant. Plus, I've seen so many pointless arguments because both parties didn't agree to the parameters or the definitions of the words that they're talking about. Anyway, given that access to medical intervention is now easier than it ever has been as far as transgender medical care goes, it's ever more important that we don't confuse sexual kink, for example, with gender dysphoria. And some experts may not separate the words transgender and transsexual, fair enough, but I do for the sake of keeping the words very linear in their definition in an attempt for clarity. So, a transsexual individual, therefore, is someone who attempts to change their reproductive tackle, i.e. their genitals, to the opposite of which they were born. Now, I personally have stopped short of transsexual for myself because I have not gotten and I do not intend to get bottom surgery. And I label myself, if I must, a transmasculine individual, meaning I was born female, appearing feminine, but have changed much of my appearance and have accepted a societal role that is more traditionally associated with men or masculine people. Not to mention, I really do have many more mental traits that are more commonly associated with men, and we'll talk about that more later. Okay, so let's start parsing apart whether or not you may be transgender. So it's best to start with recognizing what your biological sex is. I know that sounds kind of basic and silly, but in order to assess cis or trans, you first must recognize what your biological sex is. So now that you have that, let's determine the gender. So, in a video put out by Discovery News called What Does the Transgender Brain Look Like?, they stated that 76% of trans people knew that they were trans at a very young age. That wasn't me. But their brain scans were consistent with the typical scans of the gender they identified with, not their birth sex. While there is no such thing as an all-male brain or an all-female brain, there are certain characteristics which are more common to either male-identifying individuals or female-identifying individuals. So if you're questioning your identity, or even if you just want to understand better how you may behave in, let's just say, relationships, or why you see the world the way that you do, I'd recommend first finding out where the majority of your personality energy lies, either in masculine or in feminine. Of course, there's a spectrum, and you may find that you're more middle of the road. That's fine, because even that is still useful to you, because you could be identifying more as androgynous, which is defined as partly male and partly female in equal measures. A note here on non-binary. I see many folks using the term to define themselves when they don't claim either masculine or feminine, but are somewhere in between. Technically, we are all on a spectrum in between those 2 points, so everyone is then, to a degree, non-binary, if that were the definition, but in technical terms, it isn't. I did a video on this too. I will link that in the card above. So, back to finding out whether your core energy is more masculine or feminine. Even though he does a lot of work on resolving relationship issues between heterosexual couples, I highly recommend listening to John Gray, who is the author of the famous Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and he has since done follow-up books and, of course, tons of his videos on YouTube, all well worth listening to. And from there, you can start to get an understanding of what camp your brain tends to fall in, either masculine or feminine, especially as it pertains to your relationships. Gray brought to our attention at the time what was groundbreaking information, that men and women are wired differently, which results in very different ways of seeing the world, the self, and conduct of behavior, which previously we had left largely unexamined and to the realm of comedy and marriage counseling, sadly. There is a video I'm going to link in the description below, which I remember seeing. The video is titled, "It's Not About the Nail." Very, very popular video. You may have already seen it. If you haven't, please follow the link. That may be able to give you an idea of which camp you tend to fall in, either the more masculine or the feminine. And I remember the first time I saw that video, I actually almost cried a little bit, because I identified so strongly with the masculine person in that video that I felt like I had finally found my tribe. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but that whole time I hadn't realized that I'd been not fitting in with any female or feminine person, and realizing that it was because up here it was almost entirely masculine, and there was a sense of relief when I watched that video. So for me, it was a big breakthrough. For you, it may not be, but still worth watching, if for nothing else, a laugh, especially if you've ever been in a relationship before. So anyway, for myself, listening to Gray allowed me to come to the conclusion that my brain was largely masculine. I could identify most of the time with how men were purported to behave or feel in relationships. And of course, there's a spectrum there too, and nothing is completely black and white. But your brain at birth has a lot to do with how you see and feel your gender to be. There is definitely a biological component to gender expression. And furthermore, your gender can be different than your biological sex. But it doesn't mean that you are transgender. There can be very masculine females or very feminine males. who are quite comfortable with their biological sex and the way that their body looks. And all of that is okay. As we have defined transgender today, you don't necessarily have to surgically change any of your sex markers in order to identify as transgender. But I will say that typically people who identify as a gender opposite of what their biological sex is will want some of the surgeries or other medical interventions available to align themselves with how they feel. They do experience a degree of dysphoria where their physical body doesn't quite match how they feel on a gender level. So, maybe you're just now coming to terms with these feelings as an adult, like I did. As children, we accept things without question sometimes, oftentimes. But as growing adolescents and as adults, things like cultural bias, familial expectations, and our resulting feelings and conclusions tend to warp and color what we truly feel at our core. And we may not begin to address them until we start to question them ourselves. So, how do we sort through all the baggage of our experiences and separate them from who we are? And that's a tough question. There is a gender therapist on YouTube whose name is Dara Fox. And in her video titled Gender Therapist Question and Answer, quote, "My gender identity, how can I learn to trust the way I feel," unquote, she delves a bit into the ways in which we can do this. She has a book also on this topic, and full disclosure, I've not read the book, and I don't receive any kind of compensation for recommending it. But from what the reviews on Amazon say, and what little I have previewed, I'd say it's probably well worth your time if you're struggling with the question of whether or not you're transgender. And one of the big things that she poses to ask yourself is, if there was no one else on the planet, would you do XYZ? Would you make said changes? Would you feel this way if there were no one else to judge? Start with that question and apply it to anything that could indicate your feelings on gender. So, for example, if there was no one else on the planet, would you still like your body? Now, we're not talking about too fat or too thin, a nose that's too big, any of those. Question the things that are related to sex and gender. So, say for example, if you have breasts, do you like them? If you don't like them, why don't you like them? By starting all questions in the way that Dara recommends, it isolates whether or not you want them or not, and not if anyone else's opinion of them would sway how you feel. So, if other people are around, and let's say you get attention from people when you display your breasts or dress in a certain way as a female, you may not want to get rid of them because you're craving attention and likability, versus just wanting breasts because they feel right for you to have. Wanting to keep breasts, even though you don't like them, just because they give you attention, likely means there is something that you need to work through. In the card above, I'm going to link to the video I did about detransitioning, because it's theorized that people who start transitioning and then end up detransitioning because they regret it may have unresolved feelings that led them to transitioning in the first place, thinking that the transition would solve the problems that they have. And in the end, they don't. So this next point is huge. Question how you feel about men and women. Do you believe that one is inherently bad over the other? And if you do, that's a red flag. Did you maybe have a raging feminist for a mother who demonized men so that you as a male feel a sense of guilt that you are male? Did you have a super masculine father that you as a female received no attention from, and maybe your brother received lots of time with your father and lots of attention? Or were you as a female, did you experience an absent father and therefore stepped into the more masculine roles of the family and simply feel more empowered that way? These are just some classic examples and only a few of potentially hundreds. But you'll notice at least that all of these have a common theme, which is unresolved trauma from childhood regarding your parents. Your view of the sexes can also be tainted if, as an adult, you've had too many failed intimate relationships. Ensure that you have all or most of your childhood biases and failed relationship trauma straightened out before you try to determine if your gender discomfort is truly your own and not one instilled in you by your experiences. Now, when in doubt, just see a gender therapist. There is something very important to note here, that here as I speak in 2021, there is an alarming trend in the therapeutic or psychological community of medical professionals where they are being pushed to affirm when a patient comes in stating that they have gender dysphoria and that they wish to transition. It's a very dangerous situation that we're seeing right now, so not always when you see a gender therapist is it going to mean that when they say yes, you should transition, that you should, but after several appointments, after a lot of issues that you've talked through and worked through, it might be safe to say at that point that you can make a relatively well-informed decision. So bear that in mind right now. I know cost is usually a consideration for many people without insurance, so a few things that you can look into. If you work for a major company, there are EAPs, employee assistance programs, that will oftentimes offer free or very reduced mental health services. There are local universities with psych programs that will again offer free or reduced groups or services for therapy. There are group therapy sessions that are often much reduced cost, which even if they don't address your problems particularly, you get to hear that of other people and you might be able to come to some of your own conclusions just based on that. It's a bit longer of a track, but you gain a lot of experience in doing so. You can always ask a therapist if they have sliding scale benefits, as in if you are below a certain income amount, they may be able to charge you less if you can prove that you have lesser income. So it never hurts to ask. But keep in mind, just look at your budget and see where things can maybe be cut back if at all possible. Ask for a deferment on student loans, for temporary hardship. The bottom line is that you must prioritize figuring this out over most things in your life, if necessary. Your lifelong happiness and mental health is more important than a trip you might be saving for or getting to go out every weekend. And that might be what it just comes down to. Last thing to note, it can take years for you to feel comfortable enough making any kind of a transition or decision towards changing your gender or outward appearance, especially if you're anything like me and you've come quite far in your life living otherwise. Don't rush it. There could be many years behind you of being someone who likely wasn't your authentic self, and that can be scary to leave all of that behind and face the challenges and changes ahead. I can speak from experience on that. As daunting as that may be, there is so much joy and freedom in really being your true self, and I can attest to that. Follow your gut, and if it doesn't feel right, you're either not ready or it's not for you, and that's okay. For me, the deeper I got into resolving my childhood biases, and the more I learned about the transitioning process, the more attractive the idea of transitioning. Sure, I had some hesitations, and I'm linking another video in the card above, but those were unrelated to being transgender, as I later discovered. I'm also going to link another video in the card above to how I didn't know for so many years that I was transgender, for any of you who might be interested. I may revisit this video in the future if there are more things that I can think of to add, because this is an incredibly complex topic. But for now, for those who were curious and for those who asked, I do hope this helps. Peace.